It happened to me a long time ago, over 15 years ago. My father passed away, and we went to the cemetery, which was very far from our homes and isolated in the mountains. I was among those who went to bury and bid farewell to my father. After the burial and everything was done, everyone left except me. Despite their earnest attempts to bring me back with them, I refused and chose to stay by my father's side. I stayed reading the Quran by his grave. My father was the dearest person to my heart. He always showered me with love throughout my life. He was like a true friend and a wise, kind-hearted father at the same time. I couldn't bear the shock of his departure and the thought of him being alone, far from me, under the ground. I was still young then, and it was the first death I had ever experienced in my life. I remember my mind couldn't comprehend what had happened, while my eyes never dried from tears for a single moment. I remember that day my condition was pitiful. Everyone in my family tried to convince me to return with them, and some even tried to stay with me, but I refused strongly. Their repeated words about the unwise decision to stay alone in the cemetery, especially at night in the pitch darkness, were met with increasing fear on their faces. They would mention that cemeteries are places everyone fears and were perplexed and disapproving of my decision to stay alone at night. With my insistence on their departure, I remained alone by my father's grave, reading what I had memorized of the Quran, all thanks to him as he always encouraged and supported me to memorize it entirely. Suddenly, while I was reading with tears streaming down my face from the pain of separation, I heard a sound coming from inside the grave. I moved closer and kept approaching until my ear was on the grave itself. Could it be my father's voice? I screamed, calling for the cemetery keeper, who came running. I asked him, my voice trembling with terror, if he also heard the sound I heard. He replied, clearly worried about me, saying he couldn't hear anything, then stayed with me until I safely reached home. I was convinced I had heard a sound from my father's grave. A sound similar to screaming, like someone was calling for help. When I returned, I went to my uncle and asked him if my father had really died, or if perhaps he had gone into a coma and we buried him alive. My uncle was astonished by my words and told me my father had suffered an accident. Despite multiple surgeries and resuscitation attempts, he never regained consciousness, spending nearly a month unconscious. On the day he passed away, his heart, brain, and all bodily functions stopped, so how could we have buried him alive? Something inside me kept telling me that my father was still alive, and that these cries were calls for help. The next day, I went to the cemetery and stayed there, reading the Quran and praying for my father until dusk. I didn't realize it was getting dark until I heard the same cries again. I moved closer to the source of the sound and kept approaching until I discovered that the sound came from the grave next to my father's. I tried to read the inscription on the grave, only to find the name strangely erased. I hurried to the cemetery keeper and described the grave and the way the name was erased. I confessed to him how disturbing the sounds I heard 2 consecutive days from that eerie grave were.